My family always made me feel like a mere extra in the very story they were supposed to write for me. At Sunday dinners, the smiles were rehearsed, and the polite questions about my life seemed more like a formality than genuine concern. I was treated as a secondary element, a piece that did not belong to the decisive game of the family legacy. While everyone boasted about their achievements and the tradition, I found myself excluded from the definition of who was worthy of the family's assets. My grandmother Grace and my grandfather Michael, the patriarchs who founded an empire of investments in real estate, always emphasized the values of tradition and legacy. In their words, the inheritance should be destined for those who truly deserved it. And according to that logic, I could never compete with the chosen one. My cousin Sophia, the perfect granddaughter, the worthy heir. While I devoted myself diligently to my studies and worked hard at the company to learn the ins and outs of the business, Sophia traveled the world, enjoying privileges without ever having gotten her hands dirty. Before we continue with the story, I ask you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. This is very important to us. Thank you so much. Favoritism was a poison that ran through the family's veins, and in the end the decision was clear. Sophia would inherit everything. On that fateful day, while I was relegated to the role of a supporting character, my existence was reduced to being ignored, forgotten by the very family I loved so much. It was a gray, melancholic afternoon when we all gathered in the imposing mansion for my grandfather's will reading. The atmosphere was laden with formality, and an unsettling silence hung in the air. Sophia, seated in an armchair at the front, crossed her legs elegantly and displayed a victorious look, as if anticipating the glory reserved for her. My heart raced, a mixture of anxiety and resignation. Part of me still harbored a faint hope, but that hope dissipated the moment the lawyer cleared his throat and began to read. According to Michael's wishes, 90% of the family assets and investments will be transferred to his granddaughter, Sophia, the lawyer announced in a firm voice echoing through the mansion's corridors. My hands began to tremble. Those words resonated like an irrevocable sentence. The will detailed that not only the shares and properties would be in Sophia's hands, but also all the bank accounts that sustained the empire. While my grandparents exchanged satisfied glances at the outcome, Sophia wore a smile that blended triumph and contempt. For her, this was the recognition that she had always been the destined one. Then the lawyer added one last sentence that cruelly echoed in my ears. And, as a token of appreciation, granddaughter Emma will receive a symbolic compensation of $50,000. An uncomfortable silence invaded the room. $50,000. Instead of being recognized as an integral part of the family, I was reduced to a mere gesture of pity. While some uncles and cousins cast looks of sympathy, Sophia looked directly at me with a smile loaded with irony. That's what Grandpa wanted, Emma. The perfect family decision. Applause and congratulations for Sophia filled the room. However, inside me a spark ignited. I did not react out of convenience because at that very moment, I understood that fighting against the sealed decision would be useless. But secretly I had already prepared my counterattack. For years, while everyone treated me as a mere extra, I nurtured a secret no one could imagine. I discreetly controlled half of the family assets. Amid the whirlwind of emotions, I knew that in 3 months I would be at the shareholders' meeting as the family's largest shareholder. Every look, every dismissive smile thrown my way only strengthened my determination. I wouldn't need to fight openly. The revenge would be silent yet devastating. That betrayal, the exclusion from what had always been mine, would be the spark for a turnaround that would completely transform the power game. As the will was read and all eyes were fixed on Sophia, I allowed myself a brief moment to think of all the years of study, work, and sacrifice. I knew I had never been the family's favorite, but I also knew that my true worth lay in the skills and knowledge I had acquired over time. That symbolic compensation would be the last attempt to diminish my importance, but I already had a bigger plan. The reading continued as the lawyer detailed every item, every percentage. But what truly mattered to me was the revelation that I had been excluded from the inheritance in such a cold and calculated manner. The atmosphere became nearly unbearable, yet at the same time the seed of my revolt had been planted. I knew that that night would mark the beginning of a new era for me, an era in which I would take control of the legacy that had always been mine by right. As the guests began to disperse and the conversation took on a superficial celebratory tone, I remained motionless, processing every word that had been spoken. The pride and satisfaction they felt for Sophia were only a reflection of the blindness that prevented them from seeing the true injustice. That afternoon, as the sun hid behind the clouds, a new chapter was being written, not by favoritism and empty tradition, but by someone who, in the shadows, had already prepared her ascent. I left the room with firm steps and a racing heart, knowing that the power game was just beginning and that soon everyone would have to face the truth I had carefully built. The betrayal had been announced, but my revenge was about to be carried out. 3 months had passed since that fateful day when I was publicly betrayed. While the family continued with their routine of appearances and celebrations, Sophia and my grandmother Margaret acted as if the will had resolved everything. However, while everyone slept soundly, I was working behind the scenes, refining my plan with the precision of a strategist. During those months, I revisited every document, every contract, every financial transaction of Holdings, the company that represented the family legacy. My humble beginning as a financial assistant had given me a privileged view of the company's inner workings. I studied the investments in depth, the acquisition strategies, and most importantly, the complex corporate structure my grandfather had created to protect the assets against taxes and risks. It was in this context that I discovered a crucial detail. My grandfather had never owned all the company's shares. A portion had been distributed among trusted partners, many of whom were elderly, ill, or nearing retirement. Without anyone noticing, I began buying those partners' shares discreetly. Using a meticulous strategy and calculated market operations, I gradually accumulated a percentage that, without raising suspicions, approached 48%. With every transaction made, I felt the weight of revenge and justice drawing near. That was my ticket to power, the exact counterbalance to the injustice imposed upon me. It was a risky plan, but over time, those risks transformed into opportunities. My skills, once ignored, turned into transformative tools. And so, while everyone celebrated Sophia's victory, I was building my empire behind the scenes, confident that justice would prevail. On an ordinary morning, while I savored a strong coffee, the phone rang. The number was unmistakable. On the other end of the line, Sophia's arrogant and familiar voice echoed. "Emma, we need you to attend the shareholders' meeting this afternoon." I stifled an internal laugh. I knew she was calling me out of necessity and not out of genuine interest. The company was facing serious problems. Under Sophia's inexperienced leadership, risky investments were turning into significant losses, and the investors were growing impatient. Confidence in the management was disintegrating. I took a deep breath and, with the firm voice I had cultivated over the months, replied, "Of course, I'll be there." On the other end, she sighed, relieved. "Great. I know you were upset with Grandpa's decision, but we're still family. We need to work together." I merely smiled, knowing she had no idea what awaited her. This meeting would be the stage for my revelation. Upon arriving at the conference room, I was met with an atmosphere charged with tension and expectation. The shareholders gathered in silence, each pondering the uncertain future of the company. My grandmother Margaret and Sophia were seated at the main table, symbolizing the continuity of tradition. As I entered, head held high and with the posture of someone who had already overcome betrayal, Sophia gave me a forced smile, though her trembling eyes betrayed her insecurity. I sat down with the calm that only those who master their secrets can display. The chairman began the meeting with a cold presentation of the numbers. The results were poor, the investments poorly planned, and clearly Sophia's leadership couldn't reverse the situation. As she tried to justify herself, crossing her arms defensively, the shareholders' looks grew increasingly suspicious. Then the chairman announced that it was necessary to review the company's ownership structure, as the shareholder list had been updated. Sophia frowned, but she didn't have time to protest when the document was presented. In a calm voice, the chairman read aloud. "The largest shareholder of Holdings with 48% ownership is Emma." A deafening silence took over the room. My grandmother, who had always ignored me, turned pale, and Sophia, unable to hide her shock, widened her eyes in disbelief. I leaned back in my chair and with a light smile declared, "Surprise." Sophia blinked, trying to find words to explain the inexplicable. Her murmurs of disbelief were drowned out by the sound of astonished looks spreading through the room. The chairman adjusted his glasses and reaffirmed. All transactions were conducted legally. Emma now controls almost half of the company. That announcement was the turning point I had been waiting for. My gaze locked with Sophia's, and with conviction I said, "That means you cannot make any strategic decisions without my approval." The room exploded with murmurs and looks of astonishment. Sophia appeared to have taken a devastating blow, while my grandmother finally looked at me with a mixture of surprise and, perhaps, a hint of admiration. As the shareholders processed the news, I felt every second confirming the inevitability of my rise. The injustice I had suffered had transformed in that moment into poetic justice. I was not only claiming what was rightfully mine, but I was also demonstrating that, even though I had been scorned, I was the true guardian of the legacy. With the atmosphere in shock, the meeting was only just beginning, and the plan I had so carefully orchestrated was in full swing. The power game, once dominated by privileges and favoritism, was about to change hands, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The tension in the meeting room grew even thicker after the announcement. Sophia, still dazed, stood up with a mix of anger and despair. The shareholders whispered among themselves, and the expression on my grandmother's face, who until then had remained silent, revealed an internal conflict. The truth was undeniable. The game had turned, and now everyone knew that I was the real force behind Holdings. Unable to accept the reversal, Sophia finally exploded. "This is a coup," she shouted, her voice trembling with fury. "I am the CEO. I was chosen to run this company." I maintained my composure, crossing my arms and tilting my head slightly, with the serenity of someone who has faced the greatest adversities. "And what exactly have you done since you took over, Sophia?" I challenged, my firm voice cutting through the charged atmosphere. She opened her mouth to protest, but I continued, exposing the reality. "You lost millions in bad investments. You made unnecessary cuts, delayed payments to suppliers, and dragged the company into a financial hole. While you were busy with meaningless adventures, I worked to keep the tradition and the assets alive." Sophia's face turned red, her eyes glistening with a mix of anger and despair. Some shareholders exchanged glances that clearly indicated that their trust in her was lost forever. The chairman, trying to regain control of the situation, suggested, "Given the new ownership structure, it is wise for us to take a new vote of confidence in the leadership." Sophia shot a piercing look, full of bitterness. "That's not necessary." "Of course it is," I replied coldly. "We need to vote. Who here still believes that Sophia should continue as CEO?" My grandmother, with a cold look, immediately raised her hand, as if loyalty to the past outweighed any justification. Only 2 other shareholders followed suit, while the majority remained still or averted their gaze. Then the chairman asked, "And those who believe that the leadership should be reconsidered?" Hands began to rise one by one until it became clear that the majority was on my side. I looked directly at Sophia, raised my hand with conviction, and declared loudly, "This is the final blow. Sophia, you are officially removed from your position." The impact of the vote reverberated throughout the room. Sophia seemed to have taken a punch to the gut. She recoiled, fists clenched and eyes fixed on me, while the shareholders murmured in disapproval of the old order. My grandmother, who had spoken little until now, raised her voice. "This is absurd. Michael would never allow such a betrayal." I leaned back in my chair and with a serene smile responded, "Michael always wanted what was best for this company. And what's best is not Sophia." The tension deepened. Sophia, unable to hide her indignation, whispered, "You set all of this up from the beginning, didn't you? You betrayed me first, Sophia. I only ensured that in the end, the empire would remain in the hands of those who truly worked for it," I stated without hesitation. As the shareholders absorbed every word, the atmosphere became a battlefield where truth and competence prevailed over privilege and favoritism. Faces that once showed pity for me now displayed respect. My grandmother, in a gesture that blended reproach with admiration, finally looked at me with new eyes, revealing a spark of recognition. The chairman resumed speaking, proposing that, given the new reality, the leadership should be officially reorganized. The vote was practically concluded, and Sophia's downfall was imminent. The scenario, once dominated by favoritism and empty tradition, was now transforming into a new chapter where every decision was based on merit and strategy. A revolutionary mood hung in the air. Sophia, with her shoulders slumped in defeat, could barely utter one last word of resistance. And at that moment, the weight of the truth was indisputable. The shareholders' trust, Michael's legacy, and the company's future were now under my command. After the tense meeting, the atmosphere at Holdings seemed to have changed forever. Sophia was escorted out of the meeting room, not without casting one last look filled with hatred and disappointment. The silence that followed her departure was almost palpable, charged with a mix of relief and apprehension. My grandmother Margaret remained seated, lips set in a firm line and eyes fixed on the table, refusing to look at me. She had spent years ignoring me and now timidly saw the truth that I represented. I, on the other hand, felt a mixture of triumph and responsibility. I knew that this moment was the culmination of everything I had fought for, but I also understood that the new chapter required even more courage and strategy. With firm steps, I stood up and faced the shareholders who were still in shock from the turnaround. As of today, Holdings will be managed by someone who truly understands the value of work and strategy, I declared in a firm voice, leaving no doubt. I looked directly at my grandmother and added, and not by people who believe that inheritance is synonymous with unquestionable rights. My grandmother, whose stern expression revealed an internal resistance, finally looked at me, her eyes marked by a mix of incredulity and vague understanding. She murmured something about Michael's legacy, but I interrupted serenely. Michael taught me to be strong. And that's exactly what I did. Margaret took a deep breath, slowly rose and left the room without another word. Meanwhile, the shareholders began commenting among themselves, and a feeling of renewal and hope spread. In the days that followed, Sophia tried, unsuccessfully, to remain relevant. Without her position of power, the friends and allies surrounding her quickly vanished, and soon she became an irrelevant name in the business world. On the morning I officially assumed the role of CEO, I sat in the chair that had belonged to my grandfather for so long. I looked out the office window, watching the city that now represented the future of Holdings. The empire was finally in good hands. The hands of someone who had fought tirelessly to turn injustice into justice and betrayal into an opportunity to rewrite history. Reflecting on everything that had happened, I felt a deep conviction. Power does not lie in inherited privileges, but in the ability to act with intelligence, courage, and dedication. Every sacrifice, every tear, and every solitary step had brought me to this moment. And now, the legacy would be led with a vision that never underestimated anyone. In the following days, the new administration solidified, hesitant investors began to show confidence, and the numbers slowly recovered. The environment, once marked by disputes and favoritism, now buzzed with the energy of a team committed to innovation and sustainable growth. I knew that challenges would still come, but the checkmate had already been delivered. As I walked through the company's corridors, observing discreet smiles and respectful glances, I realized that every step was a victory over injustice. That girl who had always been treated as a supporting character was now writing her own story, and no one could deny that the future was under my command. And so, with the certainty of one who knows what she has done, I closed that chapter full of pain, betrayal, and ambition, paving the way for a new era of leadership. An era where true value was measured not by blood, but by merit, and where every decision was made with the conviction that the legacy would be preserved and elevated to unimaginable heights. The empire was in good hands, and those hands had finally claimed what was rightfully theirs. What did you think of this story of revenge and justice? Leave your rating from 0 to 10 in the comments and tell me which moment was your favorite. Would you have done something differently? Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and don't miss any of our stories full of twists and impactful endings.